Hi, everyone. Harry here to talk about the Supreme Court decision at the very end of last week permitting the Trump administration to begin to deport some 500,000 people from specific countries, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, who had been the beneficiaries of a 2-year parole entered by the Biden administration saying, even though you may be deportable, we won't deport you. Now, Trump, in his fashion, had issued an executive order saying, we're coming after you again. And unlike most everything he's doing, it's a sort of hard-hearted and malicious and over-the-top move, but not an unlawful one in the same way, because the parole program that Biden entered is understood to be discretionary, an act of grace by one administration that can be removed by the next. But the issue here becomes, as has been so often the case in these 135 or whatever days, the granting or the seeking of a stay, an emergency stay by the Trump administration. So the district court here held that the administration had acted unlawfully. It was arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act. They hadn't explained well enough, etc. And he said, no, you can't do this. And then the Trump administration had asked to stay this as an emergency. And the Supreme Court did that. And the effect, of course, is that it hasn't been decided whether the act was arbitrary and capricious or otherwise in violation of law. But while they are deciding, as so often, the question becomes, does the status quo stay or leave while the decision is happening back in the district court? And here, the answer from the U.S. Supreme Court is it leaves. Okay, so to talk about this a little more, so this really goes to both the Supreme Court's sometimes erratic and other courts sometimes erratic application of the so-called stay factors, and whether or not they're satisfied. So you may remember, what do you have to do to get a stay? First, it's supposed to be unusual. You're not supposed to. So the Supreme Court's or any court is not supposed to just come in and say, we're going to halt and keep the status quo and therefore temporarily invalidate here the Trump executive order while we decide. That's supposedly the case. This is all sort of equitable principles that have been developed over a couple centuries, not actual statutory law. So the question is, was it correctly applied? So you have a per curiam for 7 members of the court. We don't know who, but it goes under the emergency docket, which is just, everybody would agree, a bad way to go. But you have to do it occasionally. You know, if there is a true emergency, of course, the Trump administration just does it again and again and again. I think it's up to like 19, whereas the whole Biden and Obama administrations together did it 5 or 6 times. But they're saying emergency, we must be able to deport these people, and they serve that up to the Supreme Court. Now, the first consideration when you go through these factors, whether to grant a stay, is likelihood of success on the merits. You may remember just a couple weeks ago, Supreme Court did something really funky and controversial. They found a likelihood of success on the merits, which in that case meant the overruling of a long-standing precedent, Humphrey's executor, rather than doing it and reviewing the district court under the laws that then exist. They instead made a prediction that they're likely to overrule. That's why everyone took that as the death knell for Humphrey's executor, even though they said it was still there. Here, they do the analysis of likelihood of success, and for the reasons I've said, the administration does have a likelihood of success. They're likely to be able to go in and say, Biden did this 2-year parole. We are permitted to undo that parole. It's just a matter of executive discretion. So we have a likelihood of success. And they do. But stays, which, as I've said, are supposed to be rare, require the proponent, the person asking for a stay, to make all of four findings or all of four showings. And the two that really come to the fore here are irreparable injury and the balance of equities. So you have a dissent, a written dissent here by Justice Jackson. It's joined by Justice Sotomayor. Interestingly, it's not joined by Justice Kagan, who we can speculate about that, but I think in general is pretty strategic, savvy. It wouldn't have made a difference, and maybe this was one time where she wanted to show her bona fides to the other side of the court that she hopes to be able to draw over in individual cases. But here's what Justice Jackson said. Irreparable injury, give me a break. They're going to go around and pluck some number of these 500,000 and send them back to Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, etc. Talk about irreparable injury. And then balance of equities. All you have really on the administration side of things is, they got to wait a little while with these identified people who aren't going anywhere, or at least won't, there's no reason they can't wait. So Jackson says, and it's pretty persuasive, do we or do we not take the factors in granting stays seriously? If we do, we shouldn't grant this stay because there are two things that the United States hasn't shown and can't show. And especially when it comes to irreparable injury, you have the United States having to wait a little while for people who have spent 2 years in this parole status on the one hand, and you have the people themselves, about 530,000, who may be deported and then find out, remember, this is just a stay, so it could be they're deported. It's then determined that it was unlawful, the original executive order, and we've seen what happens when people are sent back and then they're supposed to be returned and how cooperative the administration tends to be. So it's a little technical, but I think it's very demonstrable what Jackson is saying, that, two of these four factors for granting a stay are not shown, can't be shown, point in the other direction, and you shouldn't have granted this stay. You shouldn't have upset the status quo, as you're supposed to rarely do, and especially here without the briefing, without the oral argument, and the like. So, nevertheless, the rest of the court has held, and the fact is, starting now, there's going to be knocks on the doors of some number of the 530,000, and the Supreme Court has given them authority to make the status quo, the law that is applying the executive order by Trump, and that means these folks can be deported immediately, even though it may turn out later that it was unlawful. But Supreme Court says there's showings for emergency relief have been amply or adequately demonstrated. So sorry, Jackson and Sotomayor. ICE, you can start knocking on doors right away. Talk to you later. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.